All right, buckle up, everyone, because today we're diving deep into a concept that's kind of sneaky, kind of fascinating, and, let's be honest, probably affects all of us more than we realize.
It definitely does.
We're talking about the sunk cost fallacy. You know that thing where you just can't seem to quit something, even when it's clear it's not working out, just because you've already invested so much?
Oh, I know that feeling, like when you're reading a book and it's just not grabbing you.
Exactly. Or you've poured hours into a project that's going nowhere.
But you've come this far, right?
Right. You've already put in all this time, energy, maybe even money, so you think, well, I might as well just finish it. But is that really the best decision? Or is our brain just playing tricks on us? That's what we're going to explore today.
It's amazing how powerful that pull of past investments can be. It really does make you question your own rationality sometimes.
Totally. And to help us untangle this whole sunk cost mess, we've got a stack of fascinating sources. We're talking academic lectures, research articles, even a real estate case study.
Oh, that sounds interesting. Real estate.
Yeah. We're going to see how the fallacy plays out in all sorts of unexpected areas. But first, let's get back to basics. What exactly is this sunk cost fallacy?
Well, in a nutshell, it's the tendency to continue an action, even when it's no longer the best choice, simply because we've already invested significant resources in it, and those resources, they have to be unrecoverable, sunk, gone.
Like that time I bought those concert tickets? Front row seats, no less.
Oh, no. Did you end up not liking the band?
I didn't. But I dragged myself to that concert anyway, telling myself, well, I already spent the money.
Classic sunk cost fallacy in action. The thing is, rationally, your enjoyment of the concert shouldn't depend on how much you paid for the tickets.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But tell me you haven't been there. That feeling of like, I gotta get my money's worth.
Oh, of course. We all have. Remember that classic study by Arks and Bloomer back in the 80s? The one with the theater tickets?
Oh, yeah. The one where people who paid full price were more likely to attend more shows, even if they weren't enjoying them,
Yeah,
compared to those who got a discount.
exactly. They were so focused on justifying that initial investment that they ended up enduring more bad theater.
It's like our brains are trying to convince us that we made the right decision, even when all the evidence points to the contrary. So are we all just hopelessly irrational? Is
Hmm.
there any way to break free from this sunk cost trap?
Well, that's what we're here to figure out. And thankfully, there's a ton of research out there that can help us understand this bias and maybe even learn to outsmart it.
Excellent. So where do we begin? What are some of the key insights from the research on this topic?
Well, one thing that's really interesting is how far back this research goes. I mean, people have been studying this phenomenon for decades.
Like that study, Searching for the Sunk Cost Fallacy.
Yes. That was by Friedman and his colleagues back in 2007. They were already highlighting the debate about the nature of this bias and how it's a lot more nuanced than we might think.
So it's not just about being stubborn or refusing to admit we were wrong.
No, it's way more complex than that. There are psychological factors at play, social influences, even cultural differences. It really makes you wonder how much of our decision making is truly rational.
Hmm. Food for thought. But before we get too deep into the philosophical weeds, let's bring it back to some real-world examples. You mentioned a real estate case study earlier.
Oh, right. This one's from a study in 2017 by Bao, Meng, and Wu. They looked at how the sunk cost fallacy might be influencing real estate developers in China.
China. That's a pretty big market.
It is. And what they found is that developers might be setting inflated housing prices based on the initial super high cost of land, even when the current market conditions suggest those prices are unsustainable.
So they're so focused on recouping their initial investment that they're ignoring the reality of the market.
Exactly. They're letting those sunk costs dictate their pricing strategy, even if it means potentially hurting their business in the long run.
Ouch. That's a pretty stark example of how this bias can have real-world consequences. But it's not just real estate, right? I mean, we've got examples from physical therapy education, even car insurance.
That's right. The car insurance one is particularly interesting.
Oh, tell me about that one. This I gotta hear.
Well, there's this research by Chama in 2021. He found that there's actually a higher probability of car accidents in China during the last month of car insurance policies.
Really? What? Are people just trying to get their money's worth before their policy expires?
That's exactly what Ma suggests. He thinks people might be subconsciously taking more risks on the road because they feel like they need to use up their insurance coverage.
Wow. That's a bit scary, to be honest. But it does highlight how this sunk cost thinking can pop up in the most unexpected places.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, What other hidden ways is this bias influencing our lives?
Right. It's like this invisible force shaping our decisions, often without us even realizing it.
So how do we break free from this invisible force? How do we become more aware of those sunk cost traps and make better choices?
Well, that's a great question. And it's one that we'll be tackling in the next part of our deep dive. So stick around because things are about to get really interesting.
All right, everyone, stay tuned. We'll be back after a short break to explore some strategies for overcoming the sunk cost fallacy and making more rational decisions.
All right, welcome back, everyone. So we've spent some time really digging into what the sunk cost fallacy is, and now I think it's time to get a little more practical.
Yeah, totally. Like, how do we actually deal with this thing in our lives? Knowing about it's one thing, but actually, like, changing our behavior, that feels way harder.
Oh, absolutely. It's definitely not easy. But the first step, as with most biases, honestly, is awareness. Just realizing that this fallacy
And
exists.
then we're all susceptible to it. Like, we all fall for this trap.
Exactly. It's not about being stupid or anything. It's just part of how our brains work. But once we're aware of it, then we can start to question our decisions a little more.
Step back and be like, wait a minute. Am I really doing this because it's the best choice? Or am I just, like, trying to justify all the time and money I've already sunk into this?
Exactly. It's like taking off those sunk cost colored glasses and seeing the situation for what it really is. And that can be really empowering.
It's like giving ourselves permission to change our minds. Like, we don't have to be slaves to our past decisions.
Right. And there's a lot of research out there looking at different interventions and techniques to help us do just that, to kind of like outsmart our own biases.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, one thing that's showing a lot of promise is something called decision aids.
Decision aids, what are those?
They're basically tools, often like visual aids or spreadsheets or something, that help us focus on the future costs and benefits of a decision.
So instead of getting hung up on what we've already invested, we're forced to look ahead and see what's actually going to happen.
Exactly. It's like taking the emotion out of it and just looking at the cold, hard facts. And that can be really helpful when we're trying to make a rational decision, especially when our gut feeling is telling us to stick with something we know is probably a bad idea.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like we're giving our logical brain a boost. Any other strategies?
There's also a lot of research on how the way we frame a decision can influence our choices. Like, if we can frame a decision in a way that minimizes the perceived sunk cost, we're less likely to fall into that trap.
So like instead of focusing on what we've already lost, we focus on what we could gain by changing course.
Exactly. It's a way of shifting our perspective and kind of tricking our brains into making a better choice.
It's like mental judo, using our own biases against themselves.
Exactly. But while these strategies show a lot of promise, there's still a lot more research to be done. We need to figure out what works best for different people in different situations.
Yeah, like what works for someone trying to decide whether to quit their job might not work for someone trying to decide whether to finish the giant plate of nachos.
Right. And there's the whole question of education. Like, how do we teach people, especially young people, about these biases so they can avoid falling into these traps in the first place?
Right. Like, can we build some kind of sunk cost fallacy detector into the school curriculum?
Huh. That would be amazing. But seriously, I think education is key. If we can equip people with the knowledge and tools to recognize and understand their own biases.
Then they can make better choices throughout their lives. It's like giving them a superpower.
Right, the power to make decisions based on logic and reason instead of being controlled by these unconscious biases. And that's a pretty powerful thing.
Totally agree. So we've talked about the individual level,
Hmm.
but what about the bigger picture? Like, how does this fallacy play out in organizations and even like entire
Gosh,
societies?
that's a great question. And it's something that researchers are really starting to explore more deeply.
Because, like, we've seen how sunk costs can lead to inflated housing prices in China. And we know that governments and businesses make big decisions all the time that are probably influenced by this bias.
Right. Imagine a government that's poured billions of dollars into a public works project that's clearly not working.
Oh, yeah, that happens all the time.
But they're so focused on justifying that initial investment that they just keep throwing good money after bad. It's like they're stuck in a sunk cost loop, and the taxpayers are the ones footing the bill.
Ouch. That's not a good scenario. So how do we break free from this kind of large-scale sunk cost thinking?
Well, I think transparency is key. Organizations and governments need to be more open about their decision-making processes.
And willing to admit when they've made a mistake. Like, it's okay to change course. It doesn't mean you're weak or incompetent.
Exactly. It actually shows strength and a willingness to learn from your mistakes. And that's something we need to see more of.
Agreed. So we've talked about a lot of the negative aspects of the sunk cost fallacy. But earlier you mentioned something about there being potential benefits to honoring sunk costs.
Right. It's not all doom and gloom. Persistence and commitment, those are generally considered positive qualities.
Totally. Like sometimes sticking with a difficult project or task, even when it's tempting to give up, can lead to great rewards.
Exactly. Like, think about all the successful entrepreneurs and artists and athletes who faced countless setbacks and rejections.
They kept going because they believed in what they were doing.
Right. And that persistence ultimately paid off. So I think the key is knowing when to persevere and when to cut our losses.
Which is way easier said than done, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's a delicate balance.
Yeah.
And it requires careful consideration of our goals and values.
And a willingness to be honest with ourselves about whether our efforts are truly worthwhile.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot between blindly following the sunk cost fallacy and knowing when to trust our instincts and make a change.
So it's like we're trying to find that perfect balance between respecting our past investments and being open to new possibilities.
Right. And I think that's a good place to leave things for now. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the individual level to the societal level.
And we've explored both the dangers and the potential benefits of honoring sunk costs.
But I think the most important takeaway is simply awareness. Once we understand how this bias works
We can start to recognize it in our own lives.
and make more conscious, intentional choices that align with our values and our goals.
Exactly. So as we move on to the final part of our deep dive, let's keep this idea of awareness in mind.
And see if we can come up with some practical tips and strategies for overcoming the sunk cost fallacy in our own lives.
Okay, so as we wrap up our deep dive into the sunk cost fallacy, let's take a minute to, recap everything we've learned about this sneaky little bias.
Yeah, good idea. It's been a lot of information.
It has. So we started by, defining what the sunk cost fallacy actually is.
Yeah.
That tendency to just keep clinging to something, even when it's clear it's not working out, just because we've already invested so much.
We talked about how it's not just about money. It's about time, energy, effort, any kind of resource that we feel like we've already sunk into something.
Right. And we saw how it plays out in so many different areas of life.
From personal decisions like finishing a bad book,
To professional choices,
Yeah.
like sticking with a failing project at work.
and even to those big, complex decisions that organizations and governments make.
Like those real estate developers in China who were setting inflated housing prices based on the sunk costs of the land.
Right, and that car insurance study where people were more likely to get into accidents in the last month of their policy.
It just goes to show this bias is everywhere. It's lurking in the shadows, influencing our choices in ways we don't even realize.
And it's not just about making bad decisions, it's about missing out on opportunities.
Because while we're busy clinging to those sunk costs,
We might be overlooking other, potentially better options.
so the big question is, what can we do about it? How do we break free from this sunk cost trap?
Well, I think the first step is, as we've said before, awareness.
Just knowing that this bias exists and that we're all susceptible to it can make a huge difference.
It's like shining a light on those unconscious thought patterns that are driving our decisions.
And once we're aware of them, we can start to challenge them.
We can ask ourselves those tough questions like, am I really sticking with this because it's the best choice, or am I just afraid to admit I made a mistake?
And we can start to develop strategies for overcoming those biases,
Like using decision aids to focus on the future costs and benefits.
or framing decisions in a way that minimizes the perceived sunk cost. And most importantly, we can practice self-compassion.
Because we're all going to make mistakes, we're all going to fall into those sunk cost traps sometimes.
It's part of being human. But the key is to learn from those experiences and not let them define us.
To be able to say, okay, I messed up, but I'm not going to let that past mistake dictate my future choices.
And that's really what this whole deep dive has been about.
Empowering ourselves to make better decisions.
To break free from those unconscious biases that are holding us back.
And to create a more fulfilling and meaningful life.
So as you go out into the world today, keep the sunk cost fallacy in mind.
Be mindful of those moments when you might be letting past investments cloud your judgment.
And remember, it's okay to change course, it's okay to cut your losses, and it's okay to start fresh.
Because sometimes letting go of the past is the best way to create a brighter future.
That's it for our deep dive today. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of the world of information.